All right, Alexander, let's talk about what is going on in Ukraine. And I woke up in the morning and I got the news that we had a large amount of missile strikes hitting decision-making centers in the morning. It was hitting what I got were three cities when I woke up: Lviv, Dnipropetrovsk, and Kiev, hitting decision-making centers. The most notable one was in Kiev, hitting the offices. Actually, I believe the headquarters now of the SBU. We've gotten reports that some of the German embassy may have been damaged in those strikes, but I don't have anything more to go on other than certain reports from Germany with regards to that. I don't know the extent of the damage, but as the day progressed, we ended up getting approximately 100 missiles launched into Ukraine, striking at decision-making centers, administrative buildings, bridges, electric grid, power infrastructure, railway links across multiple cities and towns in Ukraine. And we've had a statement from Russian President Vladimir Putin saying that this was a type of warning. This was in response to what Russia says is evidence that the SBU and the Zelensky regime was indeed behind the attacks, not only in Crimea, but in various other terrorist attacks that Putin referenced. He called it terrorist attacks. And Maria Zakharova has said terrorist attacks. Medvedev said terrorist attacks. Putin said terrorist attacks. My mind goes to an eventual anti-terrorist operation with the new commander of the Russian army now in place as well. So I don't know. I'm getting a feeling that something is going to change. Something's going to shift. We also have activity in Belarus as well. Belarus and Russia. And Lukashenko has come out with statements saying that mercenaries are being trained in Kiev by none other than the UK military in order to launch some sort of offensive in Belarus or some sort of regime change in Belarus. It doesn't sound far-fetched, even though Lukashenko is a very colorful character, and he does say strange things from time to time. They have tried one coup in Belarus about a year and a half ago. Why wouldn't they try another coup, especially if that would destabilize significantly, if it would destabilize Russia? So it's coming from Lukashenko. You always have to say, okay, let's wait a minute and see what Lukashenko is saying. But it doesn't sound too far-fetched. Anyway, they're going to be doing a military cooperation. I start to think of something happening from the Belarus front as well. Even the threat of something happening from the Belarus front would mean that Ukraine would have to pull out forces from the fighting in the south and the east. And finally, we have Bakhmut, the surrounding of Bakhmut, which actually I've seen videos of Wagner forces in the city of Bakhmut, and I've seen reports saying that the Ukraine military is about to pull out of Bakhmut. A lot of developments going on.
Yes.
Where do you want to begin?
So an awful lot
We've
of
got 20 minutes.
Now, I think
20 minutes. So Alexander,
we got 20 minutes. So I'm gonna make a simple
video because I've said just about everything.
I'm going to make a quick. Yes, I mean, I'm going to make a very quick start, which is I'm going to say straight away that, of course, we have seen these massive strikes today. And by the way, you said 100 missiles. I'm seeing some reports suggesting it was up to 300. And that might, in fairness, include a lot of these, small kamikaze drones, which have also apparently been used in massive quantities. But anyway, it's a huge attack. It's apparently overwhelmed Ukraine's air defense system, which is essentially broken down. It's causing huge damage to Ukraine's infrastructure. And I have to point out that, this comes weeks after week after week of predictions in the West that Russia was running out of missiles. Well, no sign of that today. I mean, they seem to be absolutely going hell for leather. Now, the big question, that there are lots of questions, but one question that obviously springs to mind is this a response to the Crimean Bridge incident, or was it something that was being prepared over time? And I think to some extent, it was also the second. Now, we've had a lot of developments on the military fronts. We've had Ukraine launching its offensives at the end of August. So far, and I think this is a point to make, they haven't achieved anything important. They've not captured any important city. The offensive in Kherson seems to have come to a stop. The offensive in Kharkiv seems to have come to a stop. Lots of talk about offensives in Zaporozhye, but that's never materialized. They've suffered huge losses. They've lost an awful lot of the equipment that the West was providing them. Their machinery, the weapon systems that they were getting from the West, those stocks have apparently become increasingly depleted. So a decision was made, and this decision was made, of course, some time ago, to incorporate the four regions into Russia, to embark on this general mobilization, calling up 300,000 men. It seems that the first of these people are now actually being fed into the battlefield units. They were people who would have been in the military just a few months before they were called up, because they then retired, and now they've been called up again, so they're pretty trained and pretty fit, and they can be sent back to their units pretty quickly. But we're going to see a steady build-up in Russian manpower on the battlefields all of this time. And then we had the announcement just a few days ago of the appointment of a new overall commander, General Surovikin, who is, by all accounts, a very aggressive military leader, and also a person who has a track record and experience of coordinating large forces involving many different parts of the military system. Anyway, he's been appointed overall commander of Russian forces conducting this operation. And it does look to me as if the reason he was appointed was less to deal with this Ukrainian offensive, which seems to be running out of steam, but rather to prepare the ground for this big counteroffensive. And then logically, and I think this is a logical thing, we now start to get the far more powerful missile strikes that we're seeing today. Except, of course, one very important event has happened in between, and that was this attack on the Crimean Bridge. There was this. Now, we've been given this information. The chief investigator, Russia's chief investigator, a man called Bastrykhin, the head of the investigative committee, had a meeting with Putin yesterday. He gave him a complicated account of how this truck, which was carrying all the explosives, was able to move around from country to country. It seems it was primed in Bulgaria, but it somehow drove through the Caucasus, presumably went there by sea. It's not clear as of this moment whether the driver was involved, whether he was a suicide bomber or whether he was a dupe, whatever it was. Now, it's clear that attack failed. It didn't achieve its intended purpose. It didn't blow up the Crimean Bridge. It damaged one roadway, but the railway lines continued to function. They're functioning as we speak. Road traffic continues to pass through the other roadway. It wasn't successful, but it does seem to have had a massive galvanizing effect with Russian public opinion. So it looks as if all of these pieces are now falling into place. And what we're now going to start to see, it seems to be inevitable, is that with Ukraine weakened in terms of its military, because it's used up so many of its military assets in these offensives to no great effect. What it seems is more likely now is that the Russians, under this aggressive and apparently highly capable commander, are now going to prepare for a big offensive. And we're starting to hear talk from people like Medvedev, which suggests that the intention is basically to wipe out Ukraine. And Lukashenko, as you rightly said, the president of Belarus, is on board. You're quite right in saying he's got very good reasons to feel nervous about what Ukraine and the West might be doing. But the important decision, the important announcement, was that a joint group of forces, Russian and Belarusian, has been created in Belarus itself. And you're absolutely right. if these troops move into Belarus, as now seems certain, they don't have to strike at Kiev. Kiev is now the Ukraine is now very overstretched. It's had to run down its militaries in places like the northern border. It's unable to reinforce its garrison in Bakhmut, which looks like it's about to fall. So they have no real choice if they're going to defend Kiev and their northern borders, but to divert troops from the battlefronts, the existing battlefronts, weakening those battlefronts and giving this very aggressive commander more scope to launch the offensive, which I'm assuming he's planning. So that, it seems to me, is the summary picture of where we stand.
What does the collective West, NATO, the EU do to counter this, if they even counter this? In other words, is their bluff going to be called? Because they've been escalating for 7 months now. Money, weapons, money, weapons. And they've been egging the Zelensky regime on to continue to escalate and to continue to up the ante with various strikes on infrastructure, even in Russia. What do they do now that Russia appears to be really taking this this seriously now with the new army general? What do you think they do now?
This is an excellent question, because just before this whole thing started, we had the Prime Minister, I believe, of Estonia saying it's becoming increasingly difficult to put together a sanctions package, another sanctions package against Russia, because they've sanctioned everything that they can realistically. There's nothing more realistically that they can do beyond that which they have already done, and it hasn't worked. Now, it seems to me that the West is now in a very difficult, or potentially very difficult, position, because they shot their bolts prematurely. They shot them too early. They sent all their weapons to Ukraine too early. They egged Ukraine to start this offensive, which it did, but that hasn't turned out well, at least not as well as perhaps some were hoping. They haven't captured Kherson. They haven't captured Lysychansk. They're not marching on Crimea. Putin's army is not defeated. So it hasn't worked out quite the way they expected, or perhaps hoped that it might. And of course, the sanctions, they've done all realistically that they can, and it's difficult to see that they can do much more. And we're now getting more and more reports, and I don't think they're, reports that we can discount. I mean, that in fact, they've also depleted their stockpiles of weapons. They don't have enough weapons to give Ukraine now to replace what it's lost. They can't keep up this supply of weapons to Ukraine. Ukraine's running out of shells. It's running out of HIMARS missiles. And of course, it's now running into problems with the Starlink communication system, which was put together in the spring and summer, and which did give Ukraine a battlefield advantage. There's a great uncertainty as to what these problems are. Some people are blaming Elon Musk. I can't see why he would want to interfere with the Starlink system. I can't believe it. It's most probable, it seems far more plausible to me, that the Russians have now found a way to interfere with it. And that's another side of what they're doing. So I think that the risk the West runs is they're now going to be faced with what is starting to look like the real war. The Russians now purposefully going on the offensive. 300,000 men, a new aggressive general, 100 missiles being launched today, Ukraine's infrastructure being destroyed. Perhaps the next attack will be on the Dnieper bridges. Who knows? Lots of things like that going on. And it doesn't really have options. It doesn't really have any idea of what to do in reply. I mean, there'll be some people who talk about sending Western troops to fight in Ukraine. I have to say, I think that the mood amongst Western electorates is solidly opposed to that. And I think Western governments wouldn't risk it. That's my own personal view. So given that that isn't the option, not before the midterm. So given that I agree. So given that that option is not on the table, I'm not really sure what they do. I mean, they pull out their embassies from Kiev, which I'm sure they're going to start doing again. That's the second time they've done it, it would seem. But other than that, other than complain angrily, other than say that, these are all war crimes and all that, what the Russians are doing, I don't really know what they can do. And I think that they don't know what they can do either. They got massive problems in their own economies, which are getting worse. I read on my own channel an editorial in the Guardian of all places, which listed this whole cascade of problems that we're suffering as a result of this war. Blamed it all on Putin, of course. No recognition that the West has played any role in this, but they didn't have any answer. They didn't know how to respond. The only thing that I can think of that they can do is not really do anything on the ground in Ukraine, but pull out whatever stop they can, press any lever they can to try some kind of political shift in Moscow itself. And maybe they'll try to divide the Russians with negotiation proposals. And we've seen increasing signs of that coming out of Washington. John Kirby seemed to be talking about the war having gone on for too long and might be negotiations needed. We've had similar comments to that effect from none other than Blinken. But I think the trouble is credibility there is so collapsed. And on the Russian side, I mean, I don't really believe any of this. And my own sense is that the danger to the political system in Moscow was not from Russia doing too much, but from Russia doing too little. And I think the Russian leadership understands that. So, as I said, attempts to play things in Moscow, I don't think are going to succeed.
Okay, final question. 5 minutes and we'll wrap up this video. Didn't the United States and the collective West know all of this going in?
Yeah.
I mean, they know that Russia has the capability to destroy Ukraine in a matter of days.
Yeah.
They must have known. They must have had military commanders who advised the Biden White House or NATO that Russia is going in very, for lack of a better word, very soft and very carefully. They're going into Ukraine. They must have known this. So why did they let it get to this point? Why did they give all their weapons up front? Why did they egg Zelensky on so much to provoke Russia? And why did they egg the Kiev regime so much to provoke Russia? Just as an example, they put this massive postcard image of the Kerch Bridge in the city center of Kiev, and they had citizens going there and taking photos of it and mocking the Russians. They propagandized and lied to their citizens. They made their citizens believe, Ukrainian citizens believe, that Russia is weak, Russia is losing. We're in a matter of months, we're going to take back Crimea. Putin's going to fall. I mean, they knew what they were doing. They were stringing the people of Ukraine along. They knew that Russia hadn't adequately responded to any of the Ukraine provocations for 7 months. Why? Why?
Well, this is a very good question, and I think it's one of those questions we're going to be debating for years. But I'm going to say two things. Firstly, I think the fact that the Russians continue to act with such restraint for 7 months created a mood of complacency and a mood of arrogance. I think people in Washington, in London, in Brussels, in Berlin, and in other capitals, and of course in Kiev itself, came to the view that the Russians are a paper tiger, that they're not really in a position to do all the things that they're doing now. That, if you can go on, hitting Crimean bridges, attacking Crimean airfields, shelling Belgorod, launching offensives here and there, that the Russians will just roll up and take it. And eventually, as I said, this will provoke a crisis in Moscow and Putin will fall. And I think that brings me to the second point, because you said that they knew that Russia had all those capabilities. But did they know?
Well, some
And
people.
that,
Some
yeah,
people,
I mean,
sorry, some people.
some people, but that's the trouble. You see, this is the problem, because I'm increasingly getting the view that political leaders are just not listening. So they were told before the war, don't disconnect Russia from SWIFT. They disconnected Russia from SWIFT. They were told by the experts, don't do it, it won't work. And they ignored the experts. They were told by the experts, don't take action against Russian energy exports. Fuel is tight, energy is tight, it's not going to have the effect that you think it will. And they went ahead and they took action against energy exports. I was listening to an interview by the CEO of Total, one of the big French energy companies, and he was saying, that nobody from the French government, from any Western government, has contacted him to discuss the issues, the questions with LNG, even though he's, his company is right central to all of this. He said, he's just not communicating. And I've heard, I got, on my live stream on Locals on Wednesday, somebody told me, and it's probably from Germany, and I'm sure this is true, by the way, that Robert Habeck, the German vice chancellor and economics minister, whenever one of his officials comes along and tells him, this isn't a good idea, if we take this particular route, it's all going to backfire, he apparently fires back and says those are Putin talking points and starts investigations of people to find out whether they're Russian agents or operating under Russian influence. And apparently there have been court cases, every single one of which, by the way, Habeck has apparently lost. So the question is, are they, there are the experts there are the people in the military, there are presumably some people in the intelligence agencies, but one does wonder whether this very ideological political class that we have, with its visceral hatred of Putin, and indeed of Russia as a whole, are capable of listening to objective advice from their experts. So things seem to be going their way superficially through, the late summer, early autumn. The Ukraine was on the offensive. And perhaps they thought they were winning, and they didn't understand that things are not quite as they seem, and that, I suspect, is partly the reason. And it's the only explanation I can come up with, but it's also an explanation which I think is supported by the surrounding facts.
They're incompetent.
They're incompetent. Yeah, they're, what they say, they who are I think it was Jesus Christ who said it, the most blind are those who will not see. I mean, they don't want to listen. They close their ears, they close their eyes to anything that contradicts their own prejudices and beliefs. And of course, you can do that up to a point, but eventually it catches up with you.
Yeah. Okay, we will leave it there, the Duran.locals.com, and also look for us now on Rockfin as well. I will put those links down below as a pinned comment. Take care, everybody.